The pale winter sun struggles through a haze of smoke above Berlin, March 1944. From the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bluff 109, Oberleutnant Hans Müller scans the horizon. He knows the drill, another wave of American B-17 seconds lumbering toward the Reich's capital. He also knows the rule that has kept him alive through countless missions. Once the bombers cross into central Germany, they fly alone. American fighters have never made it this far. Ground control confirms the sighting. Hundreds of bombers inbound. Müller steadies his nerves. He has fought thunderbolts and lightnings before, but only near the Channel coast. Over Berlin, the Luftwaffe still rules. And then something impossible. Through the glare, he spots not bombers but a formation of sleek silver aircraft glinting in the sunday, single engine, razor-lined, fast. At first he thinks they must be stragglers, daring intruders who will soon peel away. But they don't. They climb confidently, circling the bomber stream as if they own the sky. Unmöglich! Mustangs? Here? His wingman shouts over the radio. Impossible. The nearest Allied bases in England are nearly 600 miles away. No fighter in the world can escort bombers that far. It violates every law of range and endurance Müller has ever trusted. Yet the evidence is undeniable. Drop tanks under their wings, Merlin engines roaring. These American P-51 Mustangs have crossed an ocean of hostile airspace to arrive over Germany's heart. What Müller cannot yet know is that he is witnessing the moment Luftwaffe air superiority dies. For years, German fighter pilots believed in a simple equation: distance was their shield. Every Luftwaffe veteran knew that American bombers could reach Germany, but their escorts could not. The P-47 Thunderbolt, though fearsomely armed, guzzled fuel at low altitude and could barely reach the Ruhr before turning back. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning stretched farther, but even it had to abandon the bombers long before Berlin came into view. Past the Rhine, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. This assumption became the backbone of German air defense. At Jägerleitstelle, the fighter command posts, controllers guided interceptors with calm confidence. Once American bombers crossed deep into central Germany, squadrons of Messerschmitt Bluff 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf Flak 190 seconds would rise to meet them. Pilots like Oberleutnant Hans Müller had built their tactics around this reality. Swarm the bombers, tear them apart, then glide home with fuel to spare. It wasn't arrogance, it was experience. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and countless other raids had proven the pattern. The bombers might destroy factories, but they paid a terrible price. Dozens fell in flames because no Mustang, no Thunderbolt, no Lightning had ever been able to stand guard that far from England. And so, as Müller tightened his leather gloves on that March morning in 1944, he felt a grim assurance. He and his comrades were badly outnumbered, but the rules of war favored them. The Americans could launch endless bombers, yet without fighters to protect them, those giants of aluminum and steel were prey for the hunters of the Luftwaffe. What Müller and every man in his squadron did not realize was that the Americans had quietly rewritten the rules. In secret airfields across England, mechanics had fitted sleek new Mustangs with massive drop tanks. Engineers had matched an American airframe with a British Merlin engine. The result was a fighter that could do the impossible escort bombers all the way to Berlin, fight aggressively, and still return home. That revelation was about to explode over the skies of the Reich. Oberleutnant Hans Müller pressed his gloved hand against the canopy glass, staring at the familiar airfield below. For nearly 3 years, this place had been his world. The hard concrete runways of Jüterbog, just south of Berlin, were scarred with tire marks from dozens of emergency landings, some his own, many from comrades who never walked away. At 26 years old, Müller was already considered an old man by Luftwaffe standards. He had survived the Channel battles, flown over France, and clawed his way through countless interceptions against American bombers. 32 confirmed kills lined the tail of his Bf-109G, each marked with a neat black cross. But behind those victories lay exhaustion. The Luftwaffe he had joined in 1941 was not the same force that struggled now in 1944. Fuel shortages meant fewer training flights. Fresh recruits arrived at the squadron with barely 30 hours in fighters little more than targets in the sky. The once unshakable confidence of Germany's air arm was thinning, yet Müller held fast to one certainty. Deep over the Reich, the hunters still had the advantage. As he walked toward his aircraft, mechanics gave crisp salutes, their faces drawn with fatigue. The ground crew had worked through the night patching bullet holes, swapping spark plugs, and refueling with precious high-octane gasoline. Everyone knew the stakes. The sirens had wailed at dawn another American raid, this one larger than anything Müller had seen in weeks. Ground control reported hundreds of bombers inbound, droning east from the North Sea. Sliding into his cockpit, Müller adjusted the straps of his harness. He could feel the vibration of the Daimler-Benz DB 605 engine rumbling to life, its metallic growl echoing across the airfield. Over the radio came the clipped voice of Jägerleitstelle. Achtung, feindliche Bomberformation, Kurs Berlin. Alle Staffeln starten sofort. Enemy Bomberformation, Kurs Berlin. All squadrons scramble immediately. Müller's heartbeat quickened, but not from fear. He knew this pattern by heart. American fighters would escort the bombers across Belgium and perhaps into Western Germany. Then, inevitably, they would turn back. Once the escorts peeled away, the sky would open. That was when the real hunt began. He had taught younger pilots this very lesson. Wait for the moment when the bombers are alone, then strike without mercy. As his Bf 109 lifted from the runway, the thought calmed him. Over Berlin, the Luftwaffe still ruled. At least, that was what Müller believed until the day's mission shattered everything he thought he knew. The climb toward altitude was routine at first. Müller's staffel formed neatly into line, 12 Messerschmitts clawing upward through the pale morning haze. Condensation trailed from their wingtips as they rose past 15,000 feet, the city of Berlin sprawling beneath them like a sleeping giant. Radio chatter crackled with the usual rhythm controllers reporting the bombers approaching from the northwest, other squadrons vectoring to intercept. Everything felt familiar. At 18,000 feet, Müller finally saw the enemy. Black specks on the horizon, slowly growing larger, the unmistakable box formations of B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails etched like chalk lines across the sky. He had faced them many times before. The bombers moved with ponderous inevitability, an entire industrial armada pushing toward Berlin's factories and refineries. But then came the shock. Just ahead of the bomber stream, darting like silver fish in the sunlight, were aircraft Müller had never expected to see. Sleek, single-engine fighters, not Thunderbolts, not Lightnings, but something far more dangerous. They glinted brilliantly as they banked, climbing aggressively rather than breaking away. Their lines were unfamiliar, their movements unsettlingly confident. Unbekanntes Jagdflugzeug, mehrere Staffeln. Unknown fighters, several squadrons. A voice shouted over the radio, thick with disbelief. Müller squinted hard. The fighters were small, elegant, with long noses and elliptical wings. At first he thought of the British Spitfire, but no Spitfire had ever ranged this deep into the Reich. Then realization slammed into him. He had studied these silhouettes in intelligence briefings, the new American P-51 Mustang, but those reports insisted it was only a medium-range escort. The distance from England to Berlin was nearly 600 miles, far beyond the limit of any single-engine fighter. And yet, here they were, dozens of Mustangs, circling above the bombers like hawks guarding their prey. Drop tanks still clung beneath their wings, proof that they had flown incredible distance and still carried fuel to spare. A young pilot in Müller's Formation broke radio silence. Das ist unmöglich. Sie sind zu weit von England entfernt. This is impossible. They are too far from England. Müller's stomach tightened. The certainty that had steadied him minutes earlier now cracked. If the Americans had truly solved the riddle of range, then every tactic, every belief the Luftwaffe had built its defense upon, was about to collapse in the cold Berlin sky. Long before the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the sky war between Germany and America had been defined by one brutal gamble: daylight bombing. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed precision strikes in broad daylight could cripple the Reich's war machine ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail hubs. With Norden bomb sites and disciplined formations, American commanders insisted they could break Hitler's industry from the air. But there was a price. In 1943, raids like Regensburg and Schweinfurt proved the concept was possible and nearly suicidal. Hundreds of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds roared into the heart of Germany, only to be met by swarms of Luftwaffe fighters. With no escorts capable of flying the entire distance, the bombers were naked beyond the range of Spitfires, Thunderbolts and Lightnings. Losses ran into the dozens on a single mission. Whole squadrons vanished in the smoke and fire of the German heartland. The Americans called it the combat box. Tight formations of bombers bristled with machine guns, each fortress covering its neighbor with interlocking fields of fire. In theory, massed firepower would protect the formation. In practice, German pilots like Hans Müller learned to dive headlong into the box, trading risk for devastating kills. Again and again, bombers fell in flaming spirals across German fields and cities. And yet, the raids kept coming. Despite staggering losses, American industry replaced every destroyed bomber, every lost crew, with relentless speed. By late 1943, factories in the United States were producing aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Still, the equation seemed stable. Bombers could hurt Germany, but only at terrible cost. Escorts never reached far enough to truly shield them. For Müller and his comrades, that equation was a lifeline, the fragile balance that allowed the Luftwaffe to keep fighting. What no one in his staffel understood on that March morning in 1944 was that the balance had already shifted. A new fighter, sleek and silver, had been built to end the gamble once and for all. The Mustang's arrival meant the bombers would no longer fly alone. For the defenders of Berlin, that single fact would change everything. The aircraft slicing through the thin Berlin air that morning was more than just another fighter. It was the answer to a problem that had haunted the Allies for years: how to protect their bombers all the way to the target and back again. The solution came in the form of a machine that was never supposed to exist, the P-51 Mustang. Originally, the Mustang had been designed in record time for the British in 1940, a stopgap fighter with promise but limited performance. Its early versions were fast and sleek, yet underpowered at high altitude. Then came the marriage that changed everything. The American airframe joined with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, later built under license in America by Packard. The transformation was immediate. Suddenly, the Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and cruise farther than anyone thought possible. But range alone was not enough. American engineers fitted the P-51D with enormous drop tanks, 2 external fuel containers, each holding over 100 gallons. Combined with nearly 200 gallons in internal tanks, a Mustang could now escort bombers over 1,600 miles. From English airfields to Berlin and back, with fuel left for combat. What made this truly revolutionary was not just endurance, but balance. Other long-range fighters had paid for distance with crippling trade-offs: sluggish performance, light armament, or thin armor. The Mustang broke the rule. Even burdened with tanks, it could turn, climb, and dive with lethal precision. Once those tanks were jettisoned, it became a pure thoroughbred. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, almost 1,900 rounds of ammunition, and agility equal to anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. For American bomber crews, the arrival of the Mustang felt like salvation. Instead of watching escorts peel away over Belgium, they now saw silver fighters stay in formation all the way to central Germany. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Hans Müller, peering through his gun sight over Berlin, did not yet know the technical details. He did not care about fuel capacities or Packard engines. All he saw was a fact that should have been impossible for American fighters, deep in the heart of the Reich, refusing to turn back. And that sight alone was enough to shake his world. The first moments after sighting the Mustangs were filled with disbelief. Luftwaffe pilots had grown used to a certain rhythm of battle. The escorts turned back near the Rhine, the bombers pressed deeper, and then the hunters pounced. But now, as the silver fighters held steady over Berlin, that rhythm shattered. From his cockpit, Hans Müller listened to the radio crackle with confusion. Young voices, sharp with panic, filled the ether. Sie drehen nicht ab. Warum bleiben Sie hier? They're not turning back. Why are they staying here? Others insisted it must be a trick, perhaps carrier aircraft somehow smuggled into Europe. The more seasoned aces said nothing, their silence heavier than panic. The visual alone was unnerving. Dozens of Mustangs wove effortlessly through the bomber stream, jettisoning their external tanks not because they were empty, but because they were ready to fight. That gesture carried a terrible message. The Americans had fuel to spare. They were not clinging to the last fumes, they were hunting. For years, Luftwaffe strategy had relied on exploiting the weakness of American fighters. Pilots were taught to drag opponents into prolonged engagements, knowing fuel limits would eventually force them home. Now, those tactics dissolved like smoke. The Mustangs maneuvered with the aggression of aircraft flying from their home base, pulling high G turns, diving, and climbing with reckless confidence. Every German pilot understood what that meant. The Americans could fight as long as they wished. The psychological weight was crushing. Müller felt it in his own chest, a tightening that no amount of training could suppress. If the enemy could follow bombers all the way to Berlin, then nowhere in the Reich was safe. The old sanctuary of distance, the invisible wall that had protected Germany's heartland, was gone. Some pilots raged over the radio, vowing to ram the intruders if necessary. Others fell into grim silence. A few, still clinging to denial, convinced themselves the Americans must soon retreat. But as minute after minute passed, and the silver fighters stayed, confidence drained away. This was not just another mission. It was a revelation, a thunderclap that shook the Luftwaffe's faith in its own survival. The sky over Berlin had once been their hunting ground. Now, in the span of a single encounter, it had become a place where hunters and hunted had switched roles. And the realization struck every German pilot with the force of a bullet. The age of the Mustang had begun. Engines roared as the two formations closed the distance. The bombers ploughed steadily eastward, their contrails smeared against the cold March sky. Above them, the Mustangs tightened formation, wings glittering like polished steel. Hans Müller steadied his Messerschmitt, adrenaline flooding his veins. This was the moment he had trained for countless times, except nothing about today felt familiar. "Angriff beginnen! Begin the attack!" The order snapped through his headphones. His Staffel dove toward the bomber stream, yellow-nosed Bf 109 seconds cutting across the Sunday. Tracers stitched upward from the bombers' defensive guns, a web of fire meant to break their charge. Müller pressed forward anyway. He had survived this dance before. Break through the defensive fire, hammer a fortress, and slip away. But before he reached the bombers, silver shapes dropped from above. The Mustangs jettisoned their tanks in unison, metal canisters tumbling through the sky. Then they banked sharply, diving straight into the interceptor's path. Müller cursed and yanked his stick left. One Mustang slashed across his nose, guns blazing. Orange tracers ripped past his canopy. This was not the cautious attack of an escort low on fuel. This was predatory, confident flying. Around him the radio filled with shouts. "Achtung, Mustang, I am Rücken! Mustang on my tail!" Another pilot screamed as his engine exploded in smoke. Müller glanced right and saw a comrade's FWO 190 spiral downward, pursued relentlessly by a P-51 firing burst after burst. Müller pulled hard into a climbing turn, trying to shake his pursuer. The Mustang followed effortlessly, matching every move. Its Merlin engine howled, driving the American fighter faster than Müller thought possible. He tried to drag the fight into a prolonged climb, the tactic that usually forced enemy fighters to break off. But the Mustang showed no hesitation, no sign of fuel anxiety. It stayed locked on him, as though it had all the time in the world. For the first time, Müller felt hunted. The roles had reversed in an instant. Where once he had dived confidently into defenseless bombers, now he was the one scrambling, fighting for survival. The realization cut deeper than the tracers flashing past his wings. This was not just another battle. It was the birth of a new order in the skies above Germany. The Berlin sky fractured into chaos. What had begun as a disciplined interception unraveled into a storm of broken formations and frantic radio calls. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was not dictating the rhythm of battle, the Mustangs were. From his cockpit, Lieutenant Carl Weber of JG-54 pulled hard left, sweat streaking under his goggles. A silver fighter clung to his tail, spitting. 50 caliber fire. Ich kann ihn nicht abschütteln. I can't shake him, he shouted, voice cracking. He rolled desperately, but the Mustang followed, fluid and merciless. Seconds later, Weber's plane blossomed into fire, fragments tumbling toward the city below. Across the formation, Feldwebel Otto Richter saw the explosion and felt panic grip his chest. He had always trusted fuel to save him. If the Americans pressed too long, they would have to turn back, but now they pressed harder, closer, hungrier. Sie haben endlosen Treibstoff. They have endless fuel, he cried, disbelief spilling into his microphone. On the ground, inside the Jägerleitstelle bunker, controllers leaned over maps littered with colored markers. Reports poured in from every sector. Unidentified fighters, Mustangs confirmed. Still over Berlin. One officer removed his headset, face pale. Das ist unmöglich, he whispered. But impossible or not, the evidence roared through every channel. Oberstleutnant Franz Keller, a veteran ace leading elements of JG-26, tried to steady his men. He barked orders to regroup, to strike at the bombers regardless of the escorts. Yet even he felt a sinking dread. When a Mustang slashed across his wingman's path and downed him in seconds, Keller muttered into his mask, Das ist kein Kampf mehr. Das ist ein Massaker. This is no battle. It's a massacre. High above, Hauptmann Dieter Vogel attempted to climb above the bomber stream, hoping altitude might grant advantage. But 3 Mustangs rose to meet him, wings flashing. They moved with frightening coordination, covering each other seamlessly. Vogel dove away, his plan disintegrating before it began. Sie jagen uns wie Tier, he gasped. They're hunting us like animals. Even Müller, locked in his own desperate fight, heard the despair flooding the radios. It was not just fear of dying, it was the shattering of faith. The Luftwaffe had always believed the heart of Germany lay beyond the reach of American fighters. Now, in the blinding sun over Berlin, that belief disintegrated. Every pilot, every controller, every survivor of that morning carried the same dreadful realization. The sanctuary of distance was gone, and with it, the Luftwaffe's last true advantage. While German radios filled with disbelief, the voices on the American side carried a very different tone. Major James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group scanned the horizon from his Mustang's cockpit, eyes locked on the swarm of Bf 109 seconds diving into the bomber stream. He keyed his microphone, voice calm but firm. Blue flight, drop tanks now. We're staying with the bombers. One by one, silver canisters fell away, tumbling through the cold air. The Mustangs instantly felt lighter, sharper, ready for the fight. Goodson grinned behind his oxygen mask. This was exactly what they had trained for in endless drills over the English countryside, aggressive interceptions, coordinated maneuvers, fuel discipline turned into second nature. For years, American pilots had chafed at the limitations of their escorts. They had flown thunderbolts to the edge of endurance, lightning twins that struggled against German single-seaters. Too often they had been forced to turn back, leaving the bombers exposed to merciless attacks. Every pilot remembered the horror stories of Schweinfurt, of fortress crews shot apart without cover. But today was different. Today the Mustangs had carried them all the way to Berlin, and they still had hours of fuel to fight. Goodson felt no pressure to conserve, no ticking clock urging him home. Instead, he and his men could do what fighter pilots dreamed of, take the fight to the enemy on equal terms or better. Lieutenant Robert Bob Carroll, flying as Goodson's wingman, spotted a Messerschmitt diving toward the bombers. "I've got one at 2 o'clock, he called. Goodson rolled smoothly into position, his guns chattering in short, disciplined bursts. Tracers sliced through the sky, and the German fighter erupted in smoke. Carroll covered his leader instinctively, ready to strike anyone who dared approach. The radio chatter among the Americans was clipped, confident, professional. No panic, no disbelief, only calm execution of doctrine, mutual support, energy management, relentless pressure. For them, this mission was proof that the gamble had paid off. Above Berlin, as fortress crews cheered the sight of their escorts driving off attackers, Goodson allowed himself a fleeting thought. The balance of air power was shifting forever. The Luftwaffe had thrived on distance, on the sanctuary of geography. But now, with the Mustang at their side, the Americans had erased that sanctuary. Oberstleutnant Franz Keller, a decorated ace with more than 40 victories, banked his Messerschmitt hard into the Sunday. Unlike the younger pilots panicking over the radio, Keller remained composed. He had fought Spitfires over France, Thunderbolts above the Ardennes, and Lightnings in Italy. He believed experience would prevail. Ahead of him, a lone Mustang peeled away from the bomber stream, presenting itself as a tempting target. Keller steadied his breathing and pushed the throttle forward. Wird mir nicht entkommen. He will not escape. His DB-605 engine roared as he closed the distance. The German ace applied the tactic that had served him countless times: stretch the engagement, force the enemy into a climbing duel, let fuel consumption grind him down. Against Thunderbolts and Lightnings, the method had worked perfectly. Their tanks ran dry, their pilots broke off, and Keller claimed the kill. But this Mustang was different. Instead of retreating, the silver fighter answered every move with effortless precision. When Keller pulled into a steep climb, the Mustang followed. When he rolled inverted and dove, it stayed glued to his tail. Its Merlin engine sang with power, its agility unbroken by distance. Keller frowned. At this point in the battle, his opponent should have been cautious, conserving fuel for the long flight back to England. Instead, the Mustang flew like it had just taken off from a nearby airfield. The duel stretched on for minutes that felt like hours. Keller pushed his aircraft to the edge of its limits, sweat pouring down his face. The Mustang showed no sign of fatigue. In one brutal instant, the American pilot reversed into a high G turn and slid neatly behind Keller's Messerschmitt. Tracers ripped through his left wing, fuel spraying into the slipstream. Smoke filled the cockpit. Keller cursed, realization dawning. The old tactics were useless now. The Americans no longer fought with the clock against them. They fought with time on their side. As Keller bailed out, parachute blossoming above Berlin, one truth seared into his mind: the Luftwaffe had lost its final advantage. Endurance was now the Americans' weapon. The duel between Keller and the Mustang was more than a personal defeat. It was a symbol of something far larger. For years, the Luftwaffe had built its defensive doctrine on the certainty of distance. Escorts could sting at the edges, but they could not endure. Deep inside Germany, the bombers would always fly alone. That assumption had just been obliterated in front of thousands of eyes. Across the sky, German formations were unraveling. Pilots who once attacked with cold precision now hesitated, second-guessing maneuvers they had practiced 100 times. Some dove recklessly at the bombers, only to be intercepted by Mustangs before they could fire a shot. Others tried to lure the Americans into long chases, but discovered with horror that the Mustangs could chase forever. On the ground, controllers at Jägerleitstelle stared at their maps in disbelief. Symbols meant to represent unescorted bombers were now tangled with swarms of enemy fighters. Reports streamed in from every sector. Mustangs still overhead. Mustangs engaging at 20,000. Mustangs cutting off retreat. The word repeated itself until it lost all meaning. Mustang, Mustang, Mustang. For the men in the cockpits, the psychological blow was even greater than the physical losses. They had relied on a kind of invisible shield, a buffer written into the laws of physics. Now, that shield had shattered. If American fighters could reach Berlin, what city was beyond their grasp? Munich, Vienna, Prague, all suddenly seemed exposed. Hans Müller, locked in combat with another silver intruder, felt the weight of this truth press into his chest. The outcome of today's mission was no longer measured in aircraft shot down or bombers destroyed. It was measured in the collapse of certainty, the destruction of faith. The Luftwaffe had not merely lost a battle, it had lost its foundation. Every doctrine, every tactic, every promise whispered to young pilots about Germany's safety was gone. The sanctuary of distance had vanished. In its place loomed a new reality. The Americans could come anywhere, fight as long as they wished, and leave only when they decided. When the last echoes of gunfire faded above Berlin, the sky was littered with the wreckage of illusions. Trails of smoke drifted toward the ground, marking the graves of aircraft and men who had believed distance would protect them. The bombers, though scarred and punctured, pressed on toward their targets. Behind them, the silver Mustangs formed up again, their wings steady, their engines still strong. They had not merely survived the mission, they had dominated it. The Luftwaffe's losses told the story. Dozens of fighters were destroyed in the space of an hour, many more crippled and forced down in fields and forests across central Germany. Among them were veterans who had survived years of combat, men who had once been the backbone of Germany's defense. Their absence left squadrons hollow, their experience gone forever. By contrast, the American tally was almost unbelievable. A handful of Mustangs had taken damage, a few were lost to concentrated flak, but the bomber stream reached Berlin with far fewer casualties than in previous raids. What had once been suicide missions were suddenly survivable. The psychological effect on bomber crews was electric. For the first time, they felt they were not flying to certain death. Numbers soon confirmed the shift. Between early 1944 and the end of the summer, P-51 seconds escorted bombers on hundreds of raids deep into the Reich. German aircraft losses mounted at catastrophic rates, thousands destroyed in the air and on the ground. In March alone, the Luftwaffe lost more than a third of its operational strength. By June, during the lead-up to D-Day, the once feared Jagdwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Even more devastating than the statistics was the morale collapse. Pilots who had once flown with swagger now admitted defeat in diaries and letters. "If the Americans can fight us over Berlin and still go home," one surviving ace wrote, "then the war in the air is already lost." For Hans Müller and his surviving comrades, the numbers were not abstract, they were personal. Every missing pilot meant an empty bunk, an abandoned locker, a silent place at the mess table. Each absence reminded them that their shield had failed, and their skies were no longer their own. The after-action reports were clinical, but the reality was simple. The Mustang had broken the Luftwaffe's back. The battles above Berlin were not just about aircraft colliding in the sky. They represented a fundamental shift in the very nature of warfare. For decades, distance had been a shield, a natural barrier stronger than any wall of concrete or steel. Armies and strategists alike assumed that geography dictated what was possible. The Luftwaffe built its confidence on that logic. As long as American fighters could not follow their bombers into the heart of the Reich, Germany could still fight, still inflict crippling losses, still hope for survival. The arrival of the Mustang shattered that illusion. It was more than a new machine, it was proof that technology could rewrite the rules of war. By combining aerodynamic efficiency, the Merlin engine's power, and clever use of external tanks, the Allies had created a weapon that ignored geography. Suddenly, no city was too distant, no target too deep, no bomber too exposed. Strategically, this changed everything. The Luftwaffe was forced to engage on terms it could not control. German industry, already straining under relentless bombing, now faced raids escorted all the way to their doorsteps. The cost of defense skyrocketed while the chances of success dwindled. Every battle bled away irreplaceable pilots and fuel, eroding Germany's last reserves. For the Americans, the impact was transformative. The long-range escort unlocked the true power of strategic bombing. Factories, refineries, and rail hubs that once seemed untouchable were now vulnerable on a daily basis. Losses dropped, morale soared, and the bomber offensive became not just sustainable but decisive. By the summer of 1944, Allied commanders could plan raids anywhere in Germany with the confidence that Mustangs would be there to guard them. Beyond the statistics and strategy, the psychological impact was equally profound. Luftwaffe pilots spoke of the sky itself being stolen from them, of waking each morning knowing the enemy could appear over any city. That sense of inevitability crushed morale long before bombs or bullets struck. The Mustang's legacy was clear. Range and endurance were no longer limitations, but weapons in their own right. By erasing distance, the P-51 had ended the Luftwaffe's hope of controlling its own skies. It was not simply an aircraft, it was a symbol of how innovation could decide a war. As the sun dipped lower over the battered skyline of Berlin, the echoes of that morning's battle slowly faded. Trails of smoke drifted across the horizon, reminders of machines and men who had fought with everything they had. For the Luftwaffe, the day was not just another defeat, it was a revelation, one that cut deeper than numbers or losses. Distance, their oldest ally, had abandoned them. Oberleutnant Hans Müller circled back toward his airfield, fuel running low, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes. Below him, fires burned where bombs had struck rail yards and factories. Above him, the last silver Mustangs reformed around the bombers, calm and unhurried, their engines still strong. They had come into the heart of the Reich, fought with relentless aggression, and were now turning for home something German pilots had believed no enemy fighter could ever do. For Müller, and for every man who survived that day, the message was unmistakable. The sanctuary of geography no longer existed. The Reich skies were no longer German skies. From this moment forward, every mission would carry the weight of inevitability. The Americans could come when they wished, stay as long as they wished, and leave only when their task was complete. History would record the P-51 Mustang as one of the war's decisive weapons, not only for its firepower, but for its ability to erase the boundaries of distance. It turned strategic theory upside down and gave the Allies the key to unlock the industrial heart of Germany. In doing so, it broke the Luftwaffe's spirit as surely as it broke its numbers. Today, when we see a Mustang gleaming in a museum hangar or roaring across the sky at an air show, we are looking at more than polished aluminum and 6 heavy machine guns. We are looking at the moment when endurance itself became a weapon, when innovation reshaped the battlefield, and when the tide of war turned irreversibly in the Allies' favor. So now the question passes to us. In our own time, what new technology could play the same role? What invention might seem impossible today but tomorrow redefine warfare, politics, or even daily life just as dramatically as the Mustang once did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey into history's most decisive moments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are more stories waiting, stories where the impossible became real, and where the course of the world changed in the skies above.